Welcome to this conversational interview, which focuses on an anthology of poems called Noisome Ghosts. These are written poems, but many of the poems have also been recorded. My name's Linda Albertson, and I'm talking with poet Clay Thistleton, who has written Noisome Ghosts, a fascinating book of found poetry about poltergeists and ghosts who speak and write. Also joining us today is Graham Farram, who was so intrigued with Clay's poems that he decided to record many of the poems from Noisome Ghosts. In fact, Graham has recorded 42 poems from the collection. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we are recording this interview on the lands of the Duranganj people on the far south coast of New South Wales in Bega. I'd also flag now a general language warning for listeners. The language in some poems may offend. Graham's recordings of the poems complement the written poems so well, mainly because the written format of the poems is quite experimental and unusual. The poems aren't laid out on the page in a traditional poetic format. The blank areas within the poems that sit on the pages of Noisome Ghosts are themselves ghosted space and add to the sense of mystery. The meaning of the poems can be tricky to catch, and it's almost like trying to get a glimpse of a disappearing apparition or paranormal phenomena until you come across a familiar phrase or sentence and feel stabilized again. Graham, what drew you to this project?
I'd been working with Indigo Wood. He was making podcasts. This was just after the Tathra fire. He works in community radio, is up in Orange now, I believe, and he'd come home because his mother's house had burnt down at Tathra, and he thought that he might be able to offer some assistance. But then we went straight into COVID, so he was stuck here. And I bumped into him in the supermarket. I hadn't seen him for years, in fact, but he went to school with my children. So there he was, 6 foot tall with a beard, and I hadn't seen him in a very, very long time. And I said, "Oh, hi, Indy, how are you going? What are you doing?" And he goes, "Oh, well, I'm here with Mum and I'm trying to do something. I can't do nothing. I think I'm going to do a podcast called The Local Update." And I said, "Well, why don't you come along to me at the museum, our family museum here?" I was doing a history and poetry morning each Monday with a group of people. And so he came and he did that. And then it just grew from there. He was talking to individuals in the community, and one of them was a fellow who was very concerned about the bat population at the lagoon on the eastern side of town. And he said, "Graham, have you got a bat poem?" And I said, "Well, actually, of course, there are bat poems, but I remember my good friend Clay Thistleton had a bat feature in one of the ghost poems. And so I'd like to do that one, and I did. It's the Cure d'Ars, and it's about, 1300, Clay?
A bit later, maybe 19th century.
Everybody knows it. If you're into ghosts, you've heard of this guy. And we went down to the lagoon with the live recording equipment and sat there under the bats. And I got the poem out. Later I thought, I wonder if I could do it as a nice poem. But there's actually no way to say a hideous flight of bats, so that it sounds like it was a good occasion. But a friend later, when they heard the recording, said, "Oh, didn't those bat noises disturb you?"
Very good. So the poem that you mentioned, the ghost poem, what was that again?
Cure d'Ars. He's famous, a Catholic fellow, and it's a famous account. That Clay has been able to find all of these accounts. There's been a real pleasure for me. Some things I'd heard of. I think that there's a stage in, certainly in my life, when, something scary? I'd like to have a go at that, see how that goes. One occasion, I remember I was reading a short story, a bit of a haunting thing, but when I got to the end, the bathwater had gone cold.
Ah,
And the fellow said, and then I woke up. I was most disappointed, most disappointed. So the idea that these have some credence, that was really attractive to me.
yeah, sure. And honestly, who isn't fascinated with any story about ghosts, poltergeists, spectres, apparitions? We all love to hear a ghost story, don't we? Or a ghost poem. Clay, can you tell us what found poetry is and what the source documents were for this project?
Thank you for the question, Linda, and thank you for being here today with us and lending us your lovely lounge room.
My pleasure.
Found poetry is deceptive in that everybody does it. The first sort of recorded use of it is BC, the poems of Virgil and Homer being repurposed and their lines strewn through new poems. It also crops up influentially in art, found art, in that wonderful piece by Marcel Duchamp, Fountain, which is a urinal turned upside down.
All right.
But my favourite appropriator of other texts is none other than William Shakespeare, who will rip things off left, right and centre, and with his own genius for characterisation and theatricality, produce a stunning play out of a dry academic source text.
And the source of,
The source of these.
your poems here?
Yeah, well, they're all based in the literature.
Mm.
So starting in, I think it's the 5th century BC and all the way up to the current time in Seattle, there are documents that in one way or another allude to various paranormal cases. The prophet Samuel on the Witch of Endor is the first such recorded account, and that's in the book. And of course, as I've just mentioned, the ones in Seattle, Washington. So, as I say in the author's note, this is not just a book of poetry, it's a book of scholarship. Because it represents the first time that all the major cases of speaking or writing ghosts or poltergeists have been collected together in the literature, and certainly with all the minor cases that are only referenced, in footnotes and things like that. Never been done before, was dying out to have that gap filled.
It's a great achievement. It really is.
Thank you.
Yeah, and intriguing, I find. Yep. And just to explain a bit more about found poetry, it's really using another document, in this case the research about the ghosts and apparitions, and taking words and phrases, etc., from that document and creating a poem.
Yeah, a new poem.
From that, a new poem, yeah.
That's exactly correct. Each poem has, at the end of the text, has the source material, which is referred back to a bibliography. It's like doing ice sculpture, because you get this block of a monolithic text, and then you get stuck into it to winnow out the sculpture within it. It's extremely pleasant. And then for spiciness, adding extra things. So they're not purely found poems, but they're probably 90%, I would say.
And the intriguing thing is that the poems not only include words, but also symbols, things like square brackets and parentheses and
wingdings,
wingdings, blackouts, unusual fonts. So, and I know that I'm going to quote you here, I hope you don't mind, but you have described your anthology as a totally cracked book of utter weirdness. And I love that, because when you, if you're used to traditional poetry and you open Clay's book, it can be a bit disconcerting at first, but it is really worthwhile persevering and just stepping out of your comfort zone a little bit, because there's a lot of enjoyment to be had from the poems, and there's a lot of humour in there as well, I find. So with the symbols and the blackouts and the format, and, you know, some poems are in columns and you've created shapes on the page as well sometimes. How did you decide on the form for each poem?
Sometimes it was random. Other times I had a definitive idea to start with. An example is A Ghost of the Stage Door, Canberra Theatre Centre, which careful readers will note hasn't actually started yet. Each case has in its title has the time ranges before it. So 2071 starts the haunting at the Canberra Theatre Stage Door. The form of that poem was inspired by Mr. Eternity, Arthur Stace, who went and wrote the word eternity in chalk letters throughout Sydney in the 40s and 50s.
Okay.
There's a number of poems about fatal plane crashes, and you'll see a lot of planes pop up in the book. I also had the flag of Zaire, which it just occurred. The flag of Zaire has a held fist with a torch in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I had that in one poem, but unfortunately when I reformatted, I had to cut it in half. So that it's a ghost within that poem is the ghost of the flag of Zaire. But yes, sometimes they'll come with their form intact. Other times it just comes as you're writing it.
Graham, how do you decide which symbols need to be incorporated into your recordings when you're speaking the poems, and how do you do that verbally?
Thanks, Linda. I have had the pleasure of being a Shakespearean actor and done other voice-over commercials, even for radio, done some television. We haven't spoken directly about concrete poetry, but that's what I recognised it as originally. When I was given the first Bat poem, it was printed out by Indigo and his mum, and they said, "Oh, well, Clay thinks you might be able to do this one, Graham." And I could see the incredulity, but it just runs. It runs and runs and runs. So it was easy in its way to get that poem out, and it was great fun to do. And then I started looking a bit more at it, and I asked Clay, well, you know, that was fun, Clay. It's pretty quiet at the moment. Do you mind if I do some more? And then it was, how do you do some more, Graham? And I said to Clay, well, I tried to start with the easy ones. And once I'd done that, they got easier.
Yeah.
The hard ones even turned out to be easier. But there's over half of them that I haven't done yet. So how do I decide? Well, when I'm picking the poem, it's got to be something that I can say.
True.
I have to work out a way to say it. And that's been good fun.
Yep.
Sometimes creativity. I was looking in a book. I'll just briefly mention A Ghost of the Stage Door, Canberra Theatre Centre, 2071, into sometime into the future. I love it that Clay has been able to create his own ghost.
Yeah, it's great.
And it was good fun to be there with him. You know, I'd walk the boards. I can imagine, you know, sort of something scary happening in the theatre. But ghosts are everywhere. They are ubiquitous. Lucky Star's song, I've been everywhere. Well, so have the ghosts. They're everywhere. And in literature, in music, in poetry, in film, everything that I was looking at had a ghost connection for me. And I didn't know. There was a French Baroque composer who wrote a song and he put himself in it as a ghost. He decided he'd have a go. So you're in good company, Clay. But that got me thinking about what is it that we're actually doing. And I was Colin Wilson. Oh, the fellow, no, not ringing a bell. Anyway, there was a section in one of his books that spoke about synchronicity, coincidence, serendipity.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that that word was created by Horace Walpole, just for your interest. But there was a little bit in there about the library angel. Well, that definitely had to be mentioned. They were talking about Rebecca West.
Oh, yes.
And she was looking for, I didn't know this about Rebecca West, but she'd been one of the people who were recording the Nuremberg trials. And later, when I was reading a book on Braque, Georges, I was struck by the quote, "The only thing that is important in a work of art is the bit that you can't explain."
Yeah, right.
Well, she records that as well, and that was really good because I'd almost mistaked her for Vita Sackville West, because amongst all the books that I'm reading, I read a Vita Sackville West called Grand Canyon, and that was written in 1942. And at the same time, I read a book by C.S. Lewis called The Great Divorce.
Ah, okay.
And that was interesting. That was written in 1945. And this got me thinking about, well, they were pretty exciting times. And people were dying all over the place in the threat of nuclear war, Armageddon. Now, if it's unexpected, sudden death, create a ghost, well, that's what both of those books are about. What's it like? And they keep talking.
Sorry to interrupt you, Graham, but that's fascinating if you're talking about synchronicity and serendipity. That Braque quote is the epigraph to the Bristol poltergeist. Vita Sackville West's brother wrote a history of poltergeists.
There you go.
And C.S. Lewis appears in the book. Well, his ghost does. He appears to a high-ranking official of the Catholic Church and says a couple of things. Graham's recorded the poem.
Yep.
And he says, it's easier than you think you know. And the only thing that can be possibly easier is communication between the two realms. There's no other reference in the document to suggest otherwise.
And what poem is that? What's the name of that poem?
The Apparition of C.S. Lewis. I think it
and Noisome Ghosts. Yep, great. I think what we'll do at the when this will go up on Clay's website eventually, this recording, but the poems that we've mentioned from Noisome Ghosts, we'll add the page numbers. We'll put a list of the poems that have been mentioned in this interview with the page numbers. Yep. Okay. All right. Wow. It's just. And I love that quote that you had, Graham, about what is it? That's right. The only thing that matters is the bit that you can't explain.
I loved it too.
Yep.
And this is that thing of serendipity happening all the time. There were a couple in the book where the library angel has a bit of a shot at things. In The Demons in Seattle, there's a quartet of lines. The first Bible reappears and is a touch redundantly on fire in the hallway. The Enfield poltergeist. And on the kitchen floor, where it always fell, the book of desserts, open to the page, American Devil's Food.
Oh.
I'm going to have to find that recipe, and I'm going to do that as a poem too, Clay, in the long run. But then I had an opportunity, got a garage, There's been a toy car in the garage for a year. It was coming around for registration. And my son said to me, well, if you want your chance, today's the day. Go and have a look in the garage and see if you want any of those books in there. So I hadn't been in there for a year. The first thing that I found was a story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. That was pretty good. And in the C.S. Lewis book called The Great Divorce, he speaks very highly of a gentleman called George MacDonald. Well, I eventually looked up George and found him. He was ultimately given a government pension in England, but I couldn't place what exactly he'd done. And the next thing that I found was a Puffin classic, At the Back of the North Wind, George MacDonald.
There you
Rather
go.
beautiful book.
Yep.
Beautiful book.
Great.
Humanistic.
So just summing up, it's particularly helpful to have your recordings of the poems, Graham, because they really do offer another way in to Clay's poetry. They make it easy to enjoy the poems just by listening.
I
Is
thought it was
sort of-
very good right at the beginning when Clay was recommending how to use this book.
Oh, yes. Yeah. There is a guide.
Carefully, he said. And then an indication that there might be some humour in it. So I was always looking for, can I find that little bit of serendipity that amuses me? And once I'd found that poem was then easy to produce.
To record. Yep. No, it's fantastic. It's just another example of how the different art forms can intersect, I suppose, and become more accessible.
Well, I was worried, I mean, here are these things. They've either been written down or been heard by somebody and written down. And then Clay's written them all down again. And I thought, well, that's all very good, but what if you can't read? Why shouldn't people have them? And that was another impetus to me. I want to get that poem out there so that people can
That's
hear
right.
it.
And
Yeah.
it gives new life, doesn't it, to the original story, I guess. Yeah. So I'm just going to ask you, Graham, to read one of the poems. It's called The Ghost of Captain Robert D. MacLeod. It's on page 71 of Noisome Ghosts. And on the page, if you're looking at it, it's laid out in the basic form of an aeroplane, if you're looking at the aeroplane from above. And it also has a classified newspaper advertisement in the poem as well. So interesting to see it on the page. Graham's going to read it for you now.
Pages 71, 72 and 73. It fills these 3 pages, but it's very sparse on words. And it does have the newspaper advertisement, which is wonderful. So, The Ghost of Captain Robert D. MacLeod, 15th of June, 1995. Now, this was originally published by Halliday in 2008, so it's a fairly recent one, pages 61 and 62. When I last saw Bob MacLeod, 15/6/95, Glasgow Airport, he did not look at all well. He said, "How's it going, you old bastard?" But didn't want to shake my proffered hand and had to go. He had a plane to catch. I stooped to grab my bags and Bob was gone. 62. The Scotsman next day said, "Robert D. MacLeod, late of Stornoway and Glasgow, commercial pilot, passed away after a short illness, 11th of June, 1995. No flowers by request." The hand he would not shake was 4 days dead. And the plane Bob had to catch, I checked, was home to Stornoway.
Thank you. Clay, tell me about Jeff, the talking mongoose. Am I right in thinking that that was the story that got you started in this anthology?
It was. It crashed across my postgraduate work like a rash and derailed it completely. So Jeff, spelt G-E-F, he was insistent on that point, was a poltergeist in the form of a mongoose that lived on the Isle of Man in the 1930s and early 40s. As with poltergeists, they're people-centric rather than place-centric. So he haunted a young woman by the name of Voiri Irving, who lived with her father and mother, only child. There was, I just came across that name, Jeff the Talking Mongoose, in a book of ghosts, and I thought, what on earth is this? It's immediately arresting in terms of its phrasing, and I, even without reading the whole account, about a quarter of the way into 2 pages, not a big account in that book that I first came across it in, I just thought there has to be a book called Jeff the Talking Mongoose. Why there isn't is beyond my ken to know. As it turned out, there are a number of books called Jeff the Talking Mongoose. He's very well known in the literature. I should also point out that a poltergeist is not a living being. It's not that it's lived before. It's a combination of forces that, in contact with people who are going through adolescence, tend to throw out into the ether of our spirituality, religion, what have you. And Jeff came in the form of a mongoose.
Bizarre.
There were mongoose. I looked that up. That is the correct plural. There were mongoose on the Isle of Man that had been introduced in the 19th century from India to, I don't know why, maybe they were a pet, got loose, but there was a history of mongoose on the Isle of Man, and they noticed this noise coming from, like a buzzing noise coming from the wainscoting, and it got louder and louder over the days and weeks, and then it was thumpings and scratchings and all sorts of carryings on, and then it started to talk.
So it was a talking mongoose.
A talking mongoose.
As well.
About 10% of all ghost sightings reports, I'd reckon, can talk. And another 10% of that group, the really rare ones, are the poltergeists that can write. But Jeff was famous for many years on the island. He attracted the attention of Harry Price, a prominent psychical researcher of the time. You would know him, if you know the field at all, from Borley Rectory, which was known as the most haunted house in Britain. That's in the book. A number of Harry Price's cases are in the book. I don't think Harry was sold on Jeff, but certainly other people were, and certainly Jeff was. He recommended to Voiri one day that she would find evidence of him in the form of some of his fur, and they took it away and tested it. And it wasn't mongoose, and it wasn't lion, which he occasionally claimed to be. It was border collie.
Ah, okay.
But yeah, for the casual Googler, Jeff the Talking Mongoose will repay any interest that you have in it many times over, because he's so bizarre, and he was famous the world over in the time of his haunting, and he toured the island. He would steal people's lunches. He would get into businesses and knock things off shelves. As someone in the literature calls him, a Puckian character, a Shakespearean Puck.
Right, yeah. Just mischievous and hanging around and causing
trouble.
A little bit of trouble here and
the
there.
The trickster, he was part of the trickster motif.
So there you were working on your PhD and suddenly blindsided by Jeff the Talking Mongoose.
Absolutely.
And took a pretty abrupt right turn, left turn, a bit of a swerve.
Left.
And how many years later you've done all this research into talking ghosts, poltergeists?
It took 5 years from beginning to end.
Yep.
That includes 18 months editing, which I know which period you saw me in, and I was tearing my hair out because I had to translate this book that was in landscape into portrait.
Yep.
And with all those stray marks and crazy stuff, my mental health was compromised. But yeah, 2 years really just solid research, 2 years writing, and a year, say, editing and getting it ready for publication.
Yep. Fantastic. So there you go. We'll all be Googling Jeff the Talking Mongoose. Not a phrase you can forget lightly. A last question for you both. What do you hope that readers or listeners will take away from Noisome Ghosts?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm always pleased when someone tells me it's funny, because even though as the author of something I don't really have any sort of ownership of what it means, I find it extremely funny.
Yeah.
So when people ask, who's your implied reader? Well, it's me and everyone who finds it funny. The humour crept in from the sources, but it was and Shakespeare again teaches you how to do things. At the height of tragedy, there is comedy, and vice versa. Some of these stories are particularly disturbing emotionally because they're accounts of people who are dying or who have died.
Absolutely.
But in that moment, there is also humour. There's one I can think of in particular, the talking corpse of Mrs. Gower, I can't remember her particular surname, but she's lying in her coffin and she sits straight up and says, "Oh my God, I'm so tired." And I just thought that was hilarious. And with all the crazy formatting and things like that,
You could probably relate.
Yes, yes, I'm so tired. Eyes are so tired.
So that's the talking corpse of Mrs. Dower.
Mrs. Dower.
Yeah, page 38 of Noisome Ghosts.
you.
Yeah. Just one of the ones that I enjoyed was, I can't quite remember, the telephone ghost that kept on ringing, and then the end of the poem, it's like, well, you answer the telephone next time.
Yes,
I had a chuckle at that one.
Unfortunate tsunami victims ringing people up.
Yes.
But some of them are deliberately written to be obscure, and that amuses me. So I think Graham has a better answer.
Graham, what do you hope that listeners will take away from your recordings?
I think the book answers it itself. Borley Rectory, a quote that goes with the beginning of that one: "A ghost is a priceless cultural, academic and environmental asset." That should be kept in mind. Definitely. I've mentioned Georges Braque. That's the Bristol poltergeist. The bit that cannot be explained. That's wonderful. The Linton Time Slip, that's page 236. This one I really, really wanted to do, but I needed too many voices because the gentleman who's the character in this, he says, "You must realise that it is my wall and I am at liberty to write on my own walls." Well, he's written people's signatures and the dates when they were alive. Now, there's 14 Elizabeths, and I'd be struggling to get one Elizabeth out. and then there's about 30 other people. So I know it could be just done as a list, but I thought, no, I'll hang off that one for the minute.
So you might need a bit of help with that one.
Look, I'd said to Clay, if I can just work that little bit out, learn that language, like Martian. I don't speak Martian. I can't speak in runes, but I would love to have done the Prime Minister in the elevator. That would have been a good one. One of the clues was in the typography of it, as if. Now, that's such a great Australian saying, as if, I was reading Nao Marsh, New Zealand.
New Zealand, yeah. Thank
author,
you.
a book,
Christchurch.
A book called a Clutch of Constables. Now, for a detective story, you'd think, oh yes, it's all about the constables, but it wasn't. It was about the constables, the artist, and somebody was doing imitations of them. But one of the characters in the book, Nao Marsh, says, "She's the only person I know. She spoke in italics." So as if, the laconic answer,
Yep, yep.
you can look that story up, Lacon, Lacon. But I thought from the back cover, I thought this was a lovely accolade. It is the most interesting and entertaining collection I have read for a very long time. And I've been working on this book for 5 years as well. So cumulatively, we've worked up a decade's worth of work. Clay, Linda, thank you very, very much.
Yep. Well, it's an absolute pleasure, and congratulations to you both. I think you're still going to be doing some more recordings. Am I right?
Oh,
Perhaps
I think so.
you're going to be chipping away at it.
Yeah, chip away. I've got one. I only need to know what 2 dots and CA mean.
Okay. All right. Yep.
We'll get there.
Yep.
Thanks,
Well,
Linda. Thanks, Clay.
Yeah. Highly recommend dipping into Clay Thistleton's found poetry anthology, Noisome Ghosts, and the recordings that Graham has made. Definitely both you can dip in and out of quite easily. The website address?
Thank you, Linda. It sounds very egomaniacal. It's Clay Thistleton, all one word. Thistleton is like the plant, but with a T-O-N, so ClayThisTleton .wixsite, wixsite.com/Clay Thistleton. It's a portfolio of my work there, and it also links to the Indigo Wood interview that Graham did as well. So
yeah, great. So well worth a visit. And I guess if you get really stuck, you could just Google
Clay Thistleton.
Clay Thistleton. Yep.
It's not a common name.
Graham's just wanting to say something else, I think. Graham?
Just one more thing. Again, with the formatting, Clay, the South Shields poltergeist, the word scribble is there. And it's beautiful. I fell in love with just looking at it. And it reminded me of Gibbon when he'd done the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. What a book. Amazing. When he took it to the king said, scribble, scribble, scribble. I described this book as a palimpsest of scribble. Thanks, Clay. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you, Graham. And that word scribble is present in the manuscript, scanned it's written in my hand, and I've scribbled it out. It was a particularly nasty one. It communicated by SMS, and it said some very unpleasant things.
Very fascinating, and encourage everybody to dip into Clay Thistleton's Noisome Ghosts, either the hard copy, the website, and to listen to Graham's very entertaining recordings. Thank you. Goodbye.